In the MBA program, I discovered the classes that were my passion. I would find that I would get a textbook and I'd be reading it and be done virtually the entire textbook by the first 3 weeks of class. And so I was ready and engaged and excited and absolutely fell in love with that whole program. I ended up doing my MBA in entrepreneurship. It was a specialization that was available at the time. What's amusing is I was the 6th or 7th person to finish the entrepreneurship program or specialization. But I was the first to take the designation. The other 5 or 6 didn't want it on their resume because they were afraid they couldn't get a job. Just think about that mindset back then, 25, 30 years ago, where you were afraid to designate yourself as an entrepreneur because you couldn't get a job. Didn't speak much for the confidence of yourself coming out of the program. Now, admittedly, my resume implied that I had a co-major in finance because that was my other passion. Having an engineering degree, my background gave me strength in numbers, so I wasn't afraid of the numbers. Ultimately, I got on with one of the big investment banks coming out of the University of Calgary. McLeod Young Weir, it was called. I ended up working for them for almost 5 years. They announced my 5th anniversary in their internal newsletter 3 months after I quit, which speaks volumes for how big and bureaucratic they'd become. But they'd been bought by the Bank of Nova Scotia. They were a small investment bank, a regional, a Canadian boutique in a sense, as they all were. But all the banks, when the rules changed in 1987, all the banks were allowed to buy investment dealers. Big win occurred, and the partners cashed out, and the junior guys, me, got left stranded high and dry economically because the partners captured it all for their own benefit. Another learning experience. I ended up working for an investment bank. Name doesn't matter, but I worked for the guy for about 18 months, and I've never met someone more devoid of ethics. First week I was working for him, we went and picked up some information, signed a confidentiality agreement. The goal was to help them do a refinancing. The first thing he had me do when he got back to the office an hour later was start doing a merger model with one of their competitors. And that's fine, we've got the data, we can work all this stuff up. Then we took the data to the competitor to pitch them on taking over the company we just signed a confidentiality agreement with in terms of the data we'd received. And he said, look, it's up to the shareholders to make these sorts of decisions, and we don't have to worry about the ethics of having signed an agreement that we wouldn't do this. It didn't matter to him. If it just a handshake meant nothing to this guy, and again helped in formulating a lot of my feelings about what's right and what's wrong. And I spent 18 months working with someone who wasn't doing what was right, in my opinion. I was miserable, I was unhappy, and my ex-wife at the time, or my wife at the time, now my ex-wife, said to me, why don't you just get out of town? You're miserable, you're of no use to yourself, you're of no use to anybody. Get out of town, clear your head. And I took off and went to Cozumel for a week, and while I was there, finally came up with the courage, if you will, to try and start my own business. But the spark for starting my own business didn't occur until about a month later, when I was on a flight to Toronto with one of my clients, working with this other investment dealer. And he'd asked me where we were going with our business plan. And I told him, well, we're trying to build into a full-service investment bank focused on energy. And he hit me between the eyes with the question. He said, yeah, but do you have, does Jeff, the guy I was working for, have what it takes to build the team to do that? And it's not in me to lie. And so I just said, I don't think so. And the guy looks at me and says, well, if you ever go out on your own, I would hire you. That single sentence kicked off the rest of my career. If you ever go out on your own, I would hire you. Now, the complete story is he didn't hire me. It took 1.5 years before I was pitching business to him. I didn't get work, but that was the spark that gave me the courage, that took away the risk, if you will, in starting my own business. So I had made my mind up that I wanted to do it, but I didn't know how to go about doing it when I was in Cozumel. It was that single moment on the airplane when he said, I would hire you if you ever went on your own, that triggered that whole process. Ultimately, I did start Wilson Mackay, imaginatively named after Wilson and my partner, Jamie Mackay. And what we did was we brokered oil and gas properties. We brokered properties the same way a real estate agent brokers big buildings. We were brokering oil and gas properties. 1, 2, 5, 10, $20 million properties were our game. And it was early in the days of that whole world of trading oil and gas properties. There was a mindset back in the 80s and the 70s for an oil man and an oil well, it was till death do you part. I mean, people kept 1%, 2% fractional interests in oil and gas properties. And as a result, the overhead attendant with these fractured interests was huge. Someone cottoned on to the fact, well, if we consolidate interests, instead of diversifying our portfolio and sharing the risk across all these wells, if we have the smarts in-house to actually drill intelligently and make seismic-based decisions about where we want to drill and run efficient operations and own gas plants and optimize ownership, which is ultimately owning 100%, which is what most oil companies try to do now. They'll find, rarely do you find more than 2 or 3 partners in an oil well or a gas well now. But back when I started this consolidation phase, you'd have 50, 75, 100 separate owners in a unitized pool of oil and gas assets. So the opportunity was to consolidate and move assets around. We got into that game just as it began and ultimately and knocked it out of the park. We did my first year in business, my accountant, I love accountants, but they look backwards most of the time. They don't look forwards. So I know some of you are carrying accounting designations, but my real point was my accountant came to me at the end of our first year in business and said, do you really want to continue? My partner and I had made about $60,000 each. That was the grand sum of our year's efforts. And I looked at her and I said, I think so. Jamie and I each took over $1.5 million out of the business in the second year. So it was a little bit of a build-up. So she put no value on what I call the work in progress. There was no balance sheet item for it, so she didn't understand. And she was just trying to be nice and say, are you sure you want to keep doing this? Because you're not really going to make it. But she didn't see how busy we were. Out of that second year of running Wilson Mackay, I partnered with 3 other guys, and we started at the time the first national, regional, the first national boutique dealer. In Toronto-centric ways, we were labeled a regional dealer because our offices weren't in Toronto. You know, we were national in scope, but we were only based in Calgary. So if you could be in Toronto, one office, you were a national dealer, the way the regulatory agencies were set up. The other thing, and you want to talk about inefficiencies, we called the Toronto Stock Exchange, which was the SRO, the self-regulating organization for who we had to govern ourselves by, and we wanted to get the paperwork to apply to become a member. They said, well, what's your company name? So we don't have one. Well, you can't get the paperwork until you have one. What they were set up to do was, based on your name, they would allocate you to an examiner. So A to G went to one, and F to Q went to another. And so until we had a name, we couldn't get the paperwork to start. And I'm thinking, holy Christ, are there opportunities in this industry? If it's this inefficient at the start, imagine the whole process. And sure enough, it just was rife with confusion and complication, and the whole industry simplified itself greatly. But at one time, we had to report to the Toronto Stock Exchange, the Alberta Stock Exchange, the Investment Dealers Association, and then we just said screw it when it came to Quebec because there was too much paperwork. But we started First Energy from scratch. We used $2 million of capital. When we sold 20% of the firm 3 years ago to Societe Generale, we put a valuation on the company of just over $300 million. We've done about $1.5 billion, $1.2 billion in revenue in the 15 years we've been running. Run rate cash flow now is well over, run rate revenue is well over $100 million a year. And again, we started the business with $2 million of capital. I retired from the business 2 years ago. I was chairman until Christmas of last year. And I'm still one of the significant shareholders of the business, but I'm not active day to day in any of the things we do there. So lots of success building several big businesses. Along the side, I was investing, as I mentioned, in the merchant banking world. I started investing in all sorts of oil and gas companies, and we made, at the time, just made money hand over fist by being in the right place, right time, the catbird seat in terms of deal flow. So picture, absolutely beautiful in terms of wallet and ego. But through that same time, my family was falling apart. I didn't know my children. My marriage was absolutely nowhere. The more I worked, the worse my marriage was. The worse my marriage was, the more I worked. And it was very much a spiral down.